I'll be good. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to wait about a minute for people to join. And you can feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and tell everyone where you're joining from. All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Rachel Reese. I'm the Communications Associate for CF Leads, and we're really pleased today to be presenting this webinar with Welcoming America and Connecting Communities in the Americas. We have a wonderful program for you about advancing welcoming through community foundations with some really excellent speakers. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Because this is a webinar format, you can hear and see us, but we can't hear or see you. And please feel free to post any questions you may have in the Q&A box below and any other comments in the chat box, and we'll save time at the end for a Q&A. And if you have any technical issues, please feel free to join us by phone using the number on the screen. And then you also have all of that information in your registration confirmation. And then lastly, this webinar is being recorded and we'll be posting it to the CF Leads website. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Rachel Parrish, the Executive Director of Welcoming America.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and a huge thank you to CF Leads for hosting today's webinar with Welcoming America, as well as to CCA, as well as to the Mott Foundation for bringing us all together here. And to our panelists and to each of you for joining us for this conversation today. We know it's going to be a rich one. I am Rachel Parrish. I'm the Executive Director of Welcoming America. I'm joined today in the audience by my colleague Daniel Valdez, who has been leading this work with us. And if you're not familiar with Welcoming America, we are a nonprofit organization whose mission is to support communities in their leadership and work to build from the ground up a more welcoming society where all of us, including with migrant backgrounds, immigrants, and refugees, can thrive, can prosper, can belong in the places where we call home, no matter where we come from. And we do that work primarily through a network of members, about 300 members, local governments and community-based organizations and coalitions here in the United States, and a partnership of 6 networks like ours globally doing this work. We also have a tool called the Welcoming Standard, which is one of the tools that we use to support communities in exchanging best practices, learning from one another, and following a shared roadmap and shared agenda for the work of bringing down barriers so that everyone can participate civically, economically, socially in our communities. And we also run a program called Certified Welcoming, which audits communities against the policies and practices in the Welcoming Standard. And long before I came to Welcoming America, I actually started my career in community philanthropy in the demographically shifting suburbs here in the Washington, D.C. area. And through that work and through the work that I've been doing over the last decade with Welcoming America, I have seen again and again, really the powerful role that community philanthropy and community foundations specifically can be playing in this moment in history, a moment when more people than ever are on the move, when our communities are changing, and where there's a real need for leadership in navigating that. What I've also seen is that people with migrant backgrounds are, along with migration itself, really an untapped force in communities for community and economic development, for human development. And that is a theme carried the world over. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to speak at the United Nations as part of a summit that was looking at the role of migration in influencing the Sustainable Development Goals, which, if you're not familiar with them, are really about the work that community foundations do every day in trying to achieve collective impact and move the needle on big issues like inequality and prosperity for all. And increasingly around the world, there's this recognition that we can't move the needle on those things if we don't look at migration and the role of people with migrant backgrounds specifically in communities, nor can we move the needle on them without the leadership of communities, NGOs, local governments, and of course, community philanthropy. And that's because although we don't set immigration policy in communities, communities shape so much about whether people belong in our society, whether we really can participate in our communities, whether we can participate civically, whether we can participate as decision makers and leaders, as the next generation of philanthropists. And so I am so thrilled that we now have this opportunity to be having this conversation today and working over the long haul to support community foundations in what we see every day at Welcoming America, which is the incredible leadership that community foundations are already playing in sparking this conversation in their own backyards, and really helping their communities lead through it. And that was why we were so compelled to collaborate with CF Leads and CCA as well, and with many of you on this call, as we undertook the task of developing, with support from Larry McGill, who you'll hear from in just a moment, the creation of a white paper called Advancing Welcoming Through Community Foundations, really looking at what is happening now in terms of the leadership of community foundations in building more welcoming places for all, and what are the obstacles and what more can we do? And that will be the conversation we will have in just a moment. But I wanted to just share three things that I think are important coming out of that paper. And the first is, again, that community foundations are playing this incredible leadership role around immigrant inclusion, but need some new tools, a community, and really a cohesive framework to be able to show the impact that they're having and bring others along in it. And we found that our welcoming standard, which looks at very specific policies and practices in communities for reducing barriers, can be a tool in that, not only for individual communities, but as a collective to show how we are moving the needle toward becoming a more welcoming society for all. Similarly, connecting the dots to the Sustainable Development Goals and the role of equity and inclusion in those. And then I think the paper and also some of the discussions we had behind closed doors also really reinforced that this topic can be a challenge for many communities. And that's really no surprise because all around us are very pervasive narratives about people who migrate. And those biases really are everywhere, from service organizations like food banks refusing to serve people who lack legal status, to employers who might be reticent to hire somebody who doesn't have a certain set of credentials or recognized credentials, to banks that might not be willing to lend to somebody who's recently arrived as a refugee and doesn't have a credit history, to our own boards and some of the fear around working with immigrant communities. But I think, as we situate this work in the broader context of efforts to build racial equity and racial justice, and really to make our communities places where everyone can thrive, we see huge opportunity to bring folks together for some shared collaboration, some shared moral courage in wading into what can feel like a risky topic, and come out on the other end working together to really achieve that collective impact around an issue that is mattering more and more, not only for immigrants themselves and the disparities they face, but also for our democracy as a whole and our ability to thrive and belong together. So Again, I am so thrilled to be here today. Very grateful again to CF Leads. And with that, want to turn, I think, the microphone over now to Sterling, who has been just a wonderful champion and supporter. So thank you for that, Sterling, and over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. It's great to see you. Let me add my welcome to all the participants today. And we're just excited, as Rachel said, to be partnering with Welcoming America, and very excited to see how many people are on this webinar today from the Community Foundation field and beyond. I'm Sterling Spearn. I'm interim CEO at CF Leads. Just a little sad, but mostly happy that my time here is coming to an end. And many of you saw the announcement that Mary Thomas, longtime champion of community leadership and well-known leader in the Community Foundation field, will be our new CEO starting next month. And I know that many of you on the webinar are familiar with CF Leads, but for those that aren't, let me just say a few words. We're a national network of community foundations, really promoting community leadership among community foundations. And we work with community foundations from around the country of all sizes, who want to come together and to sort of support and strengthen their community leadership muscle, and tackle the key issues of our time. To do this, we offer the pioneering Executive Leadership Institute for CEOs, and now for VPs and also CFOs, that come together in peer learning cohorts over a period of time to advance community leadership back in their community foundations. We also host numerous issue networks, like the one today, Connecting Communities in the Americas, generously funded by the Mott Foundation and the Inter-American Foundation. We are currently hosting issue networks on economic mobility, on gun violence prevention, and racial equity. And then we also host and offer webinars like this one today, usually on on topics of interest to the field itself. Along that line, all of our programming, since it's informed by the field, our communications director, Melody McLean, asked me to put in a plug that if you haven't already filled out the issues of interest survey that's currently live, and I think there'll be a link going up in the chat, please do so. We really aspire to have a database and a catalog of all the issues that are of interest to community foundations throughout the country, and now increasingly across the Western Hemisphere, from Canada to South America. So we know that welcoming newcomers is an area that community foundations are extremely interested in, and our Connecting Communities in the Americas is a great example of that. Right now, we are hosting, in collaboration with Community Foundations of Canada and Comunalia, the Association of Community Foundations in Mexico, this Inter-American exchange program that's working with community foundations in the United States and those in Central America, Mexico, Haiti, and South America. So with that, I'd love to turn this over to my good colleague, Lisa Shala, who is Project Director for Connecting Communities in the Americas. Lisa, take it away.
Thank you very much, Sterling. Yes, so I am the project director for Connecting Communities in the Americas. My name is Lisa Shala. My professional and personal experience expands over the United States and Mexico over many years. And this is an initiative that was really started by community foundations and their networks, exploring this idea of what would happen if we started working together, collaborating together, having conversations across countries, and how could that really strengthen the local impact that we have. With that came the opportunity to provide grants to community foundations across countries to do some mapping survey research of their own transnational communities, people in migration, whether they're coming or going or in transit, or maybe returning back home. And then what relationships could we build across countries now that we have this information to strengthen our local communities? And this is where we really had the opportunity then to work together with Welcoming America, who also within the United States is very focused on this. So we introduced them to some of the community foundations that we were working with so that they could conduct these interviews for this report that's being presented today. And two of those foundations are represented today on a panel discussion. So the way that this will work out is that we'll have Larry McGill start as the lead researcher for the report. He'll give us an overview of the findings of the report and how this was done. That will be followed by a panel discussion that I'll lead with two of our participants, Alex Baum from the Greater Dubuque Community Foundation and Patricia Mejia from the San Antonio Area Foundation. So both of them were Connecting Communities in the Americas grantees, and we're continuing to work together on follow-up projects of how to engage the immigrant and diaspora communities in our regions. And then Larry will join us as well for a panel discussion. We'll close them today with a Q&A session for everyone. So I'd like to hand it right over to Larry to give us a brief summary of what this study was about and some of the really very interesting findings that we had.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa, and especially thank you again for all the help that you provided at the beginning of the project in linking us up with some very important efforts that are happening in different parts of the United States that are connected with the work you're doing with Connecting Communities in the America. I'm Larry McGill. I'm an independent consultant working on behalf of the nonprofit sector in general and community foundations in particular. I was formerly director of the research at Foundation Center and later Candid, but now I'm working independently, also located in the DC area, just like Rachel. Early last year, we reached out to 17 community foundations to learn about the work that they're doing related to immigrant integration, or what Welcoming America calls welcoming work. As you can see, they represent a spectrum of foundations from the Northeast, West, Midwest, and South. We had several questions on our mind. What kinds of welcoming work are they currently doing? What are the main issues facing their community, and what are the strategic priorities of their foundation? And how does their immigration-related work connect with these priorities? With few exceptions, what we've learned more or less validates the old saw that if you've seen one community foundation, you've seen one community foundation. Immigration-related work falls into lots of different organizational buckets: community impact, community investment, community strategies and initiatives, thriving communities, social justice ecology, grant-making initiatives, and collective impact. It's rare that welcoming work represents a key pillar of a community foundation's work, and in many cases, the work is limited to supporting specific immigrant-serving organizations, such as M-Schools or a local migrant resource center, or focuses fairly narrowly on specific aspects of welcoming work, such as equitable access to legal services, adult English language acquisition, financial literacy programs, and microloans. But they are doing this work, and a lot of it seems to be the result of truly heroic efforts being made by specific individuals at each foundation. The bottom line, though, is that few community foundations have robust, long-term funding in place for welcoming work. So what each individual foundation is able to do tends to be fairly limited compared to the scope of the need represented by immigrant communities. For the next slide, please. The intent of the Advancing Welcoming Through Community Foundations project is to unlock the vast potential that community foundations can bring to welcoming work. There are natural points of connection between welcoming work and the values and goals of community foundations. Welcoming work is all about inclusion and belonging, and almost every community foundation professes a commitment to equity and inclusion. In Canada, the notion of belonging has begun to supplant the idea of inclusion as a guiding concept for the work of community foundations. In many ways, belonging is an even more powerful concept than inclusion, and it doesn't take much imagination to broaden the concept of equity from our current focus on racial or gender equity to encompass equity for newcomers as well. But most importantly, what's missing from much of the work of welcoming work of community foundations is the ability to leverage the power of networks. This is what sets the work of Welcoming America apart from most other efforts to address the issue of immigrant integration. In partnership with more than 300 local governmental and nonprofit organizations across the United States, Welcoming America links local organizations to each other in ways that allow each to accomplish more together. The proof is in the outcomes. To date, Welcoming America's work in local communities across the US has resulted in 18 cities and counties being formally designated as welcoming places, a designation that can only be obtained by implementing a rigorous set of policies, programs, and processes outlined in the strategic framework that Rachel mentioned, the Welcoming Standard. Next slide, please. As you can see, the Welcoming Standard, which was developed in collaboration with immigrant advocates, local governments, private sector leaders, and academics, has identified 7 interlocking areas of work that must be thoroughly addressed in order for a place to be designated as certified welcoming. Specifically, government and community leadership, equitable access, civic engagement, connected communities, education, economic development, and safe communities. And it's no small feat to meet the specific requirements of each aspect of the Welcoming Standard. In the government and community leadership pillar, for example, there are 27 requirements, one of which is that the local government must have 1 or more staff positions whose responsibilities include advancing immigrant inclusion. Likewise, one of the requirements in the equitable access pillar is that programs must be available that inform immigrants of workers' rights, workplace safety regulations, and available legal advice on employment and workplace issues. Meeting each of the Welcoming Standard requirements represents a measure of progress toward becoming a welcoming community. Likewise, there is another set of standards you may have heard about called the Sustainable Development Goals. While the Welcoming Standard identifies the processes by which a place can become welcoming, the SDGs provide a roadmap for building an equitable, prosperous, and sustainable world right down to the community level. The practices and processes set out in the Welcoming Standard, in fact, can be mapped onto the SDG framework. The specific details of this mapping can be found in the project report we released earlier this year. The fact that we can do this mapping illustrates 2 important points. Welcoming work, in fact, contributes to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And second, the Welcoming Standard represents a specific example of how the SDGs can be focused through the lens of a particular issue as a powerful way of moving work forward on that issue. I'll close my remarks with the following thought. Welcoming begins as an attitude and an intention to invite newcomers into local communities, but it takes sustainable collective effort to ensure that such attitudes and intentions develop into policies, actions, and networks that make welcoming possible at the community level. Heroes are great, but heroism isn't sustainable. Networks are. Thanks. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Larry. This report really is very interesting for community foundations and gives us, another way of thinking about our work and who we are including in our communities and who might be left out, even if unintentionally. And so it's really important work. And I must say that Welcoming America and its ability to bring in these networks of municipal and civil society together, I've never seen it quite like that before. The Welcoming Interactive conference that they have was really an eye-opener for connecting communities in the Americas as well, of how that could look, especially in working with local governments. So we want to move right on ahead to the panel discussion and invite Alex and Patricia to join us, and Larry to join back in with us as well. So Patricia and Alex, you've both done mapping research projects with connecting communities in the Americas through grants from CF Leads. You've both worked with Welcoming America and had attended their conferences. Your really trying to figure out where your community foundation is and that role that it needs to be playing within your communities, for newcomers, for people in movement. In the case of San Antonio, you've got this very interesting historical situation where you have all generations of Latino families living there, people coming in also from other areas of the country. So I'm really interested in just hearing from each of you. We'll start with Patricia, of how did your foundation decide to look at your Latinx community more broadly, and then more specifically moving forward, like the immigrant community? What does it see its role as? What do networks look like? Who are your partners on the ground for that?
Well, thank you. I thank you, Lisa, for the question, and thank you for all those who are participating. And I also would be remiss if I didn't thank those who helped to make this happen. It was wonderful to read the work that Larry put together. I can't express enough how important that piece of work is. I often think that community foundations, we pride ourselves in knowing communities and understanding the needs of communities, but sometimes that means that we keep our heads down, focused only on our community, and don't necessarily pick our head up and see how that's connected to what's happening across the country, or in this case, across the world. And so a huge thank you to all those who were part of that research. Lisa, you asked a lot of questions, and I'm going to try real hard to answer them, but I want to start with the incredible history that San Antonio has. We are 65% Latino. And in that, we have a history of being Mexico not too long ago. If you're a historian, it was just yesterday. And so there's a really interesting reality when you come to San Antonio. You can immediately feel the culture, the language of multiple places. And so it is wonderful to be able to lead some of the work to connect and welcome communities. While that's true, we also recognize that power structures don't always align with demographics. And I say that with a very heavy heart. But traditionally, community foundations, as they were designed, were to benefit those who are generous with their dollars to be able to assist the greatest challenges. And oftentimes in San Antonio, that looked a certain way, right? It wasn't the most diverse set of donors. But I will say that we have the great fortune, and I encourage anybody who's working in a community foundation to really look at the diversity of your donors. A few years ago, migration has always been an issue, but when the children migration happened a few years ago, and there was a lot coming through San Antonio, we happened to be a compassionate city, so many children were being brought to San Antonio. We had both kind of a moral imperative to ask, who do we want to be? And the city of San Antonio really stood up and said, our stance of who we want to be is a compassionate city. And the reason I connect that with our donors is that it became obviously a political issue. Immigration is a political issue. And so we had to ask some very hard questions within the community foundation of where do we align? Luckily, we were able to say that city leadership was taking a great step forward, and we wanted to join with that city leadership in helping. And that includes both elected officials as well as government officials, those who are not elected. And did incredible things I will talk a little bit more about later. But one of the things I wanted to encourage about looking very closely at the diversity of your donors, when we had some very difficult conversations and deciding what stance we wanted to take, I was able to say one of our most generous donors was an immigrant himself. And I told the story of, I've done a lot of research on him in particular. His name is John L. Santikos. And I asked, I researched, what was his family fleeing from? And they were fleeing from a civil war, and they found refuge here. And he and his entire family became some of the greatest philanthropists the community has ever seen. And so I just think it's really interesting. It's a long answer to say, we just have to really be creative. And not walk away from the politics of it and recognize how that influences the discussion, but to think very clearly about when it comes to welcoming communities, there is really only one way that you can do it. And so every community has to strategize. And for us, we had to look who are our donor bases and who is our donor base. And we had to say, that is reflective, and that is what they would have wanted, and that was helpful for us. But I look forward to more of the conversation.
Thank you, Patricia. Alex, what can you tell us about the context of Greater Dubuque? Your work has been going on for a few years now with the newcomer populations generally, and you're in a more rural area than San Antonio is. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Lisa. And like Patricia, I want to say thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you to CF Leads, Welcoming America, and CCA, who have all provided us with support and technical assistance as we kind of began this journey. And it's so important to have this conversation right now, because I firmly believe that community foundations are almost ideally centered to be at the centerpiece of this conversation around immigration. So for those of you who don't know Dubuque, Iowa, we are a city of about 60,000 people centered right on the Mississippi River, at the point where Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa all meet together. And our foundation serves a 7-county region that is primarily rural in Northeast Iowa. And we began our process because Dubuque is full of passionate, caring people. We have over 400 nonprofit organizations for a city of 60,000, which is maybe a little bit too much. But while we are rich in resources and rich in caring people, we struggle with communication, and we struggle with being able to strategize and work collectively in order to solve problems on a systemic level. And so it was about 3 years ago that our CEO, Nancy, began the process of an immigration community assessment, where we said, look, if we want to work collectively on these issues, if we want to come together, we need to understand the landscape. We need to understand where our assets lie and what some of the barriers may be. And we need to find some models that we can look at implementing within our region. This program really got underway, and we were looking to do focus groups and conversations starting in March of 2020, which didn't work ideally, but I think really was a remarkable point for us, because the connections that we had built as a community foundation and the work that we did became much more important for the response that our community could have to the COVID pandemic. It didn't make sense to utilize the information we were gathering and the relationships we were building for a report that was going to come down the pipeline several months from now. People were dying. People were in trouble. And so we became very actively involved in the on-the-ground, hands dirty work that was taking place. And that became so important because, like I said, communication and coordination isn't always the strong part of our community. Let me give an example of that. When I first began, so we have a growing Mayan Guatemalan population within Dubuque. This is a community, many of whom come to Dubuque as unaccompanied minors, not speaking English, not even speaking Spanish, but speaking indigenous dialects like Ixil and Quiche and Conjubal, languages we are not prepared to assist with in our community. And there are a lot of organizations doing incredible work with this community, but we found early on in our community assessment, they weren't talking to each other. Until we called people together around a table, many of them had not had a conversation about this population they were both serving and both struggling with. Fast forward to 12 months later from that first meeting, and those connections that we were building led to actual on-the-ground changes in programming. A lot of our unaccompanied minors were in a school that may have been the largest institution they had ever seen, with limited educational history, and there was no one at that school building who spoke their language. And because of school district's requirements, they weren't able to hire anyone from the community. But it was through Catholic Charities in our community identifying a community member who they thought was responsible and could really help out, the Community Foundation connecting a private donor to be able to fund the local community college to hire that individual to serve as a volunteer mentor at a school district. All of a sudden, we had a navigator, an educator, somebody in the schools being able to work with these unaccompanied minors. And it made a world of difference, having somebody there, not only speaking the language, but able to culturally and personally engage with these students who otherwise were adrift. And that's what I mean about community foundations being so perfectly centered, is we have connections with donors, we have connections with those service organizations and nonprofits, we have connections with government entities, and we have connections with those incredible leaders within the communities. And being able to play that role and have knowledge about it, it makes a difference.
Thank you, Alex. And that brings us back to Larry's point on this networking, right? That seems to be so essential. And like you say, that community foundations are really in a great place to foster. I also hear you talking about local nonprofits, in this case, not as community foundation grantees, but really as partners and experts in this area of belonging. And so I'd love to hear more from you, Patricia, as well. Like, how do you see this, the potential for this network happening? And what can CF Leads and Welcoming America do? Like, what role could we play to support your work in building networks to make San Antonio a more welcoming, compassionate city?
Yeah, to pick off a little bit about what you said before I answer the question about the role of the nonprofits, the truth is we can choose to do this work or not, and we being nonprofits, but there's always going to be incredible community leaders who are going to step up and do this, whether or not they have our support. And I am deeply grateful for those very heroic individuals, as Larry described. And so for us locally, we just simply had to listen. And that sounds like such a cliche thing, but we really just had to stand in line with the experts and ask, how can we support what you're doing? They have been doing this for years, generations. One could argue even longer. Whether they're coming from a faith perspective, they're coming from an economic perspective, that they recognize the power of this immigrant community to really build their local region. And there are so many nonprofits who are supporting. When I think about what CF Leads or Welcoming America can do is exactly what you're already doing. I wasn't, trying to just be nice when I said that the critical part of this report, as I read it, was thinking about, sometimes as we're so connected into our work, we don't always have the academic language, or we don't have the synthesis of what is happening. But when somebody sits back like Larry and listens to us, then he can concisely say it. And what that allows me to do in this particular position is come back to those who are questioning, whether it be board members or whether it be government officials, and to say, look, this is what's happening across the country and across the world. Do we want to align? So I can't overstate how important this research is to really very simply talk about what the things that we're doing that are great in welcoming, but how far we have to go. When I think about, deepening the network, Lisa, try not to get too red. But, since I have started working with CCA, or Connecting Communities Across the Americas, my whole world has changed. I, as being a longtime Texas resident who has a family in Mexico, I had not necessarily thought about, all I had been focused on was equity, redistributing resources. The connection with CCA has allowed me to go deeper and to think about what can I do to connect with community foundations across the Americas that would allow us to really better understand the communities. Not that we hadn't been doing that, because we had, but it hadn't been with the same level of intention until we had the ability to do our mapping project. And then to go to different conferences, whether we hosted them here or I recently got to travel to Mexico, just to hear and see what people in other countries are doing for the exact same group of people. You know, they were probably in Mexico just a few weeks before they ended up in San Antonio. Is just remarkable. So I can't say enough about building the network, about trusting those who are at the front line, not needing to feel like we need to come up with the solutions, but trust those who are working with those communities. And then I think most importantly, to figure out how we can collectively change the narrative about the contributions of immigrants. That is so critical, particularly in conservative areas, but we have a lot of work to do. But as Alex said, I think we are, as community foundations, perfectly positioned to really be translators of multiple things.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Larry, I'd love to give you a chance to respond to the same question, coming in as a researcher, kind of from the outside of this, and having listened to these community foundations. You know Welcoming America very well. You've come to know CF Leads and a bit of Connecting Communities in the Americas. Where do you see, you've talked to us about the potential of community foundations. Where do you see what we could do to really support community foundations in this work even more?
Well, I think dwelling on that question in particular is kind of the heart of things right now. In terms of what I saw and what I heard in talking with people at different foundations across the country, there was a hunger for finding a sense of community themselves among others who are doing this kind of work. In many instances, it's a single individual, maybe even a part of an individual who's doing this work at a community foundation. And one of the hardest things to do, and you know, Alex is one of the people I'm thinking about when I think about, you know, kind of the heroic efforts people have to undertake. Patricia, you're my hero too. But I have an example from Alex that I wanted to lift up, and that is the fact that, you know, he didn't have a roadmap, he didn't have a guidebook, he didn't have a welcoming standard. At least I don't think you had a welcoming standard to work with when you began this work. But you used, you know, your intuitive sense of how connections could be made in order to make some changes happen that could only happen if those connections were made, all right? And what I find, you know, especially promising is that Welcoming America and CF Leads are institutions who have done a lot of thinking about A, what is it that, you know, is required to make a welcoming community? And B, what is the role of a community foundation in terms of community leadership? And I really see both of those things that are brought, you know, from the two organizations as, you know, essentially dovetailing and providing a roadmap for actually doing this kind of work in a sustainable way. That's why I bring the Sustainable Development Goals into this process, because I think the overarching message is, if we do this work, how can we do it in a way that creates enduring networks, enduring partnerships, and enduring ways of working that don't rely on a single individual having to do all the heavy lifting?
I agree, absolutely. This idea of really institutionalizing welcoming, like, if I left, would this, you know, would this continue? I think we often ask ourselves that, working in the community foundation world. We may have particular passions for certain projects or for certain groups of people, but it's not around that heroic passion, as you name it. It's really about, how do we get this into systems that are more equitable across the community, not with our traditional community that we've always listened to, but how do we bring others into that and relate it to the racial equity question and inclusion? I mean, it needs to be bigger, and the community foundations across the Americas are really asking themselves and now working together in more collaboration and conversation around what does it look like to make something have more of a systemic influence. So thank you so much. I wish we could continue with the conversation because I know Alex and Patricia, you have such rich experience behind you and a lot more to share. We do, however, want to open it up to questions. So Melody and Rachel, I think you are going to help us with some of the audience questions if we have any right now. For the panelists, has there been anything that's come up that somebody would like to ask the panelists?
Nothing yet, Lisa, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we can pose them to the panelists.
Okay. And in the meantime, Patricia or Alex, how about if you address this question about how to work with your board of directors and kind of nudge them if they're not already going in this direction?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, Alex, and then pass it off to you. I can just speak to my experience. For me, it was a very difficult, probably one of the most challenging days of my career. And I've been in social justice work for about 25 years. To really ask ourselves the hard questions when some particular folks were saying things like, you know, what will happen if we take this stance? And with almost tears in my eyes, I had to say, what if we don't? And I think those very difficult conversations is a strategy. It is, we can't avoid them. You know, I am very proud that after much conversation, we were able to come to a side that did land us that would be described now as welcoming. But I also, you know, as I said earlier, I think it's you have to think through, what if we didn't, and not to assume that all donors are not in support of immigrants. And as I shared with you earlier, I have the great fortune of being able to tell one story of one donor. But I think it's important to think about that and to have those honest conversations, that we cannot assume what future donors or existing donors believe about immigration. And to engage in the conversation and to challenge that. I believe one of the things I said is not only if we don't do this, but also let's see what's going to open up for us if we do, who is not at the table that has been waiting for us to take this stance. And I'm happy to say that actually took maybe just a few days before people came in support, and we're very excited that the foundation was taking this stance. Of course, there were a few that were upset, but I will say that there were more that were in support of this and thought it is the right thing to do. We are the leader and can be the leader in making collaboration happen in our community.
Thank you very much. Alex, would you like to comment?
I completely agree with that. It may not surprise many of you to know that issues of immigration can be controversial in Iowa right now. And when our CEO, Nancy, was first beginning this work, there were a lot of questions about, are we going to be involved in anything illegal? What is this going to mean for the foundation? And a lot of those conversations were challenging. But if I can offer some encouragement, I have seen a marked shift over the past several years about what people, the realization of how important immigration is to communities like ours, especially in rural areas. In our 7-county region, the population growth between 2010 and 2021, 97% of that can be attributed to the growth in the foreign-born population. 97%. there are businesses in our communities who are desperate for employees, for workers, who are actively asking about how to increase immigration and how to gain cultural competency working with individuals. Just a few weeks ago, we were doing some research in a small town about an hour north of Dubuque, working with a die-cast manufacturer who over the past few years had been hiring Latino workers at an enormous rate. Now it makes up about 40% of their workforce. And they were furious that they weren't able to hire more, that there weren't the laws in place, but also that they weren't able to encourage housing development within their community to be able to attract people. A number of their workers were traveling over an hour to work at this location. And they had to turn away business over the past few years because they weren't able to hire enough people. And now as that business has started to slow, they wish they had those additional clients that they could work to. And not only is that important for them, it's important for their existing employees as well, whether they are immigrant or whether they've been living in that small rural community their entire lives. It's making a real difference for people. And I think people are starting to recognize that and starting to address that. And part of our job is to shift that narrative, right? Like we've been talking about, and provide a roadmap for people to understand, yes, this is how we can do this, how we can become a welcoming community that is able to flourish. Because, kind of mirroring what Patricia said, it's not just the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. For our community, it's kind of the only thing to do if we're going to address the demographic reality that's taking place.
Thank you. And we've heard that from a lot of our community foundations who've done this mapping research. I know within Welcoming America as well, the sort of testimonies that you've received back from the different cities who have engaged themselves with this work have really said the same thing. This is our world. This we need to move forward with what's happening and really look at those assets as well. With CF Leads and Connecting Communities in the Americas, there's a very strong focus on this peer learning aspect as well, that you also get at the Welcoming America conference every year. What was that like? Because in CCA, you're actually partnering and having conversations in different languages with community foundations in Brazil or Mexico. And yet you're a very place-based, place-focused community foundation. Why even have conversations like this?
I'll jump in quickly. I think it has been incredibly valuable to be able to see those additional experiences. San Antonio was able to host us to come out for a while, and the amount that I learned over those few days was really valuable. And just to give you an example of the kind of direction, one of the questions that was raised to me by somebody who is working with a community trust in Haiti, the Haiti Community Trust, was talking about the conception that immigrant communities have of home, right? What is home to a community that might still be sending remittances back to rural Guatemala? Or we have a large Pacific Islander population for whom home stretches thousands of miles right now. And if we have residents in our community who have that conception of home, what does that mean for us as a community foundation that is trying to make our community the best home that it can be for those residents? And it's not just a philosophical point. A few months ago, we had a COVID outbreak in the Marshall Islands, and we have a significant Marshall Island population, and a lot of the local leaders were really concerned about what was taking place. There wasn't medicine available, there weren't masks available, a lot of the hospitals were understaffed, and they wanted to be able to raise some of these goods and be able to ship them over. This is not, supplying hospitals in the Marshall Islands is not necessarily our remit at the Community Foundation. But this was a really important thing, under the leadership of local community members. And we had the connections and the relationships to be able to help and to be able to get donations from the county health department and get donations from local hospitals and community centers and be able to get a pretty significant shipment of supplies sent back to the Marshall Islands. And our community members appreciated it and they recognized it, and it meant a lot to them. And I think it has only built our relationship with those community members. And that wasn't done through grant work necessarily. It was done by knowing who lived in our community and what was important to them.
Precisely. Yes. Knowing them, Patricia, you talked about listening, just listening, building these relationships so that you can play a part in this great thing that happened, that the Community Foundation, it wasn't any programming of theirs, but you could simply play a role in connecting people so that these people were able to get something done that was very important to them. We do have a question from Janet on the Q&A. She says, Alex mentioned cultural competency. How can we ensure that we're creating socially conscious infrastructures, either as a community foundation or simply as a member of the community?
Go ahead, Alex.
That's a big question too.
Well, I'll
Something
just really-
absolutely to
Go
ponder.
ahead, Patrice.
Just
I
two
have
seconds.
an hour and a half to talk. I want to say on this.
Yeah, I'm sure we both could do a whole another 2 hours, but I have a really simple answer for me. I've spent an incredible amount of time building arguably the best team in any community foundation. And I believe that lived experience matters. And I think it gives us an advantage, right? You don't have to necessarily bring people along because they've lived it themselves. And I think we can't underestimate it. I mean, I know that we can answer that question in 5 different ways, but I just want to tell you, for me, one of the most powerful things has been to completely change who's helping to make these decisions and navigate these relationships with these organizations.
Thank you. Alex, quickly, and then we'll
Very
close.
quickly, I would love to say so much, but I completely agree with that comment on lived experience. And I would also like to say, community foundations play a huge role in shaping our systems, especially in smaller communities. And so it's important for us to be able to learn and to be able to get that knowledge so that when we're at the table dealing with housing crises or dealing with workforce shortages, we have an expertise or at least a connection to people who have that expertise so that we can bring that into the conversation. In his report, Larry talked about timely priority issues and how those can be used as a way to leverage the immigration conversation. Immigration is central to so many of those issues that we're talking about. And we have the opportunity to play the role as, if not the experts, then the people who know the experts. That can really flesh out these conversations and make them truly equitable.
Thank you so much. That was a great closing remark, actually. And we'd love to thank again all of our participants today. Thank you, Larry, for sharing about this very valuable work that you were able to lead. Rachel and Sterling, for your leadership as well at Welcoming America and CF Leads, even if it was sort of short-term interim and now you get to go more closely toward retirement. This was a very rich conversation. I hope that it's inspiring for those that are on this call today, and that you really get this sense that Welcoming America as a network is there, and those conversations can help to lead you in the direction that you want to go. CF Leads, with its peer learning programs, connecting communities in the Americas with its very cross-country conversations. This is about really listening to each other, hearing from each other, so that we better know which ways to move forward and getting encouragement from each other. So thank you everyone so much for participating in this call, and we truly hope to see you at future events and online events that are happening. Thank you again so much.
Thank you, everyone.